The gentle rays of the morning sun peeked through the window, gently waking me. Glancing at the clock, I saw it wasn't even 6 a.m. yet. The habit of rising early, ingrained from years of teaching, hadn't changed even after retirement. As I slowly rose from bed and opened the window, a refreshing spring breeze caressed my cheeks. "Well, let's do our best today too," I murmured to myself, as if trying to boost my own spirits. My name is Martha Thompson. I'm 62 years old now. I taught English at the local high school for 35 years before retiring 2 years ago. These days, I live with my son Robert, his wife Sarah, and my adorable 5-year-old grandson Jimmy. While preparing breakfast, my thoughts drift to my family. Robert works for a local construction company. He's earnest and hardworking, but lately, he's been looking a bit worn out. Sarah is a kind and thoughtful daughter-in-law. She's a full-time homemaker, dedicated to housework and childcare. And then there's Jimmy. Just seeing that child's smile warms my heart. "Good morning, Grandma." I turned around to find Jimmy still in his pajamas, rubbing his sleepy eyes. "Good morning, Jimmy. You're up early," I said. I picked up my grandson and kissed him on the cheek. The soft scent of his hair reminded me of the youthfulness of my former students. Breakfast time. The sight of my family gathered around the table fills me with happiness. However, lately, I've been sensing something off. The warmth between Robert and Sarah doesn't seem the same as before. After finishing breakfast and seeing Jimmy off to kindergarten, I start tending to the garden. As I care for the flowers, I'm reminded of my former students. Watching them grow was one of the great joys of my life. And now, I'm deeply grateful for the time I get to spend with my beloved family. Finishing up in the garden, I return to the house to find Sarah lost in thought in the living room. Her expression seemed tinged with sadness, as if she had something weighing on her mind. "Sarah, is everything all right?" I gently called out to her. Sarah looked up, a bit startled, and forced a smile. "Oh, Martha. I'm fine, just thinking about some things." I sat down next to her and gently placed my hand on her shoulder. "You've seemed troubled lately. Would you like to talk about it?" Sarah hesitated for a moment before letting out a deep sigh. "Actually, I'm worried about Robert." Her words sent a wave of anxiety through my chest. "What do you mean?" "Robert's been acting strange lately. I don't know if it's work stress, but he's been coming home late, and when he is home, he seems irritable." There were tears glistening in Sarah's eyes. I squeezed her hand. "I see. Come to think of it, Robert has seemed a bit different lately." Sarah continued, "And it seems to be affecting Jimmy too. Yesterday, Jimmy said, 'Daddy's scary.'" Hearing those words broke my heart. I could feel cracks forming in our precious family. "Sarah, what specific changes have you noticed in Robert?" I asked quietly. Sarah thought for a moment before answering. "He's been taking phone calls in secret, suddenly going out more often. And he's grown cold towards me too." As I listened silently to Sarah's story, I reflected on Robert's recent behavior. Indeed, he had become more taciturn and seemed to be spending less time with the family. "Have you tried talking to Robert about this?" I asked, and Sarah shook her head sadly. "I've tried, but he just says, it's just work being busy, and brushes me off." Our conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Jimmy had returned from kindergarten. "Mommy." "Grandma," his cheerful voice rang out. Sarah quickly wiped her eyes and put on a smile. "Welcome home, Jimmy. Did you have fun today?" Jimmy began happily recounting his day at kindergarten, but I noticed a shadow of anxiety in his eyes. I didn't miss this change in my grandson. That night, at the dinner table, Robert came home late and began eating in silence. The family conversation lacked its usual warmth and felt awkward. After dinner, Jimmy sat on my lap and said in a small voice, "Grandma, I wish Daddy and Mommy would make up." Those words tightened my chest. As I gently embraced Jimmy, I wondered what I could do to protect my family's happiness. That morning began like any other ordinary day. However, deep in my heart, I felt an ominous premonition swirling. At the breakfast table, Sarah's chair was the only one empty. When I asked, "Where's Sarah?" Robert answered expressionlessly, "Seems she left early." His attitude struck me as odd, but I didn't press further. All day long, there was no word from Sarah. As evening approached, a heavy rain began to fall outside. As the wind howled and trees swayed violently, my anxiety only grew. "Robert, hasn't Sarah come back yet?" I asked. He avoided eye contact and curtly replied, "She's probably working late." As night fell, the storm intensified. My heart raced to the sound of rain pelting the windows and distant thunder. Suddenly, I heard Robert cry out, "Jimmy!" We frantically searched the house, but Jimmy was nowhere to be found. "He might have gone outside," Robert said. Trembling with fear, I grabbed a flashlight, put on a raincoat, and dashed outside. Beaten by the fierce rain and wind, I searched the garden. "Jimmy! Jimmy!" I called out repeatedly, but there was no response. Then, I spotted the old doghouse in the corner of the garden. From there, I could faintly hear the sound of sobbing. "Jimmy!" I called out as I approached the doghouse. Peering inside, I found Jimmy sitting there, shivering. "Grandma," Jimmy said in a tearful voice. I quickly scooped Jimmy up and carried him back to the house. Robert was waiting at the entrance, but his expression was strangely calm. In the living room, I wrapped Jimmy in a blanket and gave him a warm drink. Gently, I asked, "Why did you go outside?" Jimmy answered in a trembling voice, "Daddy, to Mommy." "What did Daddy do to Mommy?" I asked, holding my breath. And then, Jimmy's next words changed my world completely. "Daddy pushed Mommy into the incinerator." In that moment, my mind went blank. Jimmy's words echoed in my head as if in slow motion. "What do you mean?" I asked in a shaky voice. Jimmy continued between sobs, "Daddy and Mommy were fighting loudly, then Daddy dragged Mommy to the incinerator." I was at a loss for words. Looking at Robert next to me, I saw his face had turned pale. "No, that's not," Robert mumbled, but his voice lacked conviction. From that night on, my world changed completely. Even as morning came, it felt like last night's nightmare was still continuing. At the breakfast table, Sarah's seat was empty as usual. Jimmy sat silently, not touching his food. Robert was restless, constantly checking the clock. I took a deep breath and made a decision. "Robert, I'm going to call the police." Robert looked up, startled. "What are you talking about, Mom? Sarah will surely come back. There's no need for the police." "But what Jimmy said. That's a misunderstanding." Robert raised his voice. Jimmy, frightened by this, hid behind me. With trembling hands, I picked up the phone and called the police. "Yes, my daughter-in-law is missing. And," I continued, choosing my words carefully, "there's a possibility that my son may have harmed his wife." After I hung up, Robert was looking at me with eyes full of anger. "Why would you?" However, his words were interrupted by the doorbell. The police had arrived surprisingly quickly. 2 officers entered the house. They carefully assessed the situation and began asking detailed questions about Sarah's disappearance. "You haven't seen your wife since yesterday morning?" one officer asked Robert. Robert answered nervously, "Yes, she seemed to have left early." The other officer began asking about the incinerator. I didn't miss how Robert's face tensed for a moment. The officers went out to the garden to examine the incinerator. Meanwhile, I held Jimmy, trying to comfort him. "Grandma, I'm scared," Jimmy said in a small voice. "It's okay, Jimmy. Grandma's here with you," I answered, but I could feel my own voice trembling. When the officers returned, they began asking Robert more questions with serious expressions. Robert's answers seemed vague and sometimes contradictory. That afternoon, the police announced they would launch a full investigation. They asked for a photo of Sarah, so I began searching for her album. As I looked through the album, I steeled my resolve. Not only would I rely on the police investigation, but I also needed to uncover the truth myself. For Sarah's sake, and for Jimmy's. As the sun was rising, the police forensics team arrived. They headed towards the incinerator in the garden and carefully began their investigation. I watched from the window, unable to calm my racing heart. Robert paced back and forth in the room, clearly agitated. "This is concerning. What will the neighbors think?" he muttered. I found his words unsettling. It sounded as if he was more worried about the neighbors' gossip than his wife's well-being. A few hours later, the head of the forensics team entered the house. His expression was grim, and my heart began to race. "We found what appears to be human bones in the incinerator," he said quietly. At those words, the air in the room seemed to freeze. Robert collapsed into a chair, covering his face with his hands. However, the forensic officer continued, "Further tests are needed to determine if these bones are recent and if they belong to the victim." With a trembling voice, I asked, "How long will that take?" "DNA testing can take anywhere from a few days to a few weeks. We'll rush it, but we need time to get accurate results. That afternoon, the police took Robert to the station for questioning. As he left, I thought I saw fear and regret in his eyes. Jimmy clung to me anxiously. "Grandma, where is Daddy going?" "It's okay, Jimmy. Daddy's just going to talk with the police for a bit," I answered gently, but I could feel my voice shaking. That night, a neighbor came to visit. The news of Sarah's disappearance had already spread throughout the town. "Martha, I'm so sorry about what's happened," my neighbor Janet said. "Actually, I saw Sarah's car on the night she disappeared." I caught my breath. "Where did you see it?" "Near the old warehouse on the outskirts of town." "But it wasn't Sarah driving, it was Robert?" I asked. Janet nodded. "Yes, it was definitely Robert. But he was alone." This new information left my head spinning. Where was Sarah, and did Robert really? After receiving this information from Janet, I contacted the police. They immediately began searching the warehouse on the outskirts of town. That evening, I received a call from the police. "Mrs. Thompson, we found someone who appears to be Sarah in the basement of the warehouse. We're in the process of rescuing her now." My heart raced at those words. "Is she alive?" I asked, holding my breath. "Yes, she's conscious but seems to be in a weakened state. We'll transport her to the hospital immediately." I rushed to the hospital. When I arrived, a police officer was waiting for me. "Sarah's condition is stable. However, she seems to have been through quite an ordeal," he explained. When I entered the hospital room, Sarah was lying in bed. She looked thin, pale, and had dark circles under her eyes. But she was alive. That fact alone brought tears to my eyes. "Sarah." I took her hand. Sarah weakly opened her eyes and looked at me. "Martha." Her voice was hoarse. "It's okay, you're safe now," I said gently. After Sarah calmed down a bit, she slowly began to speak. "Robert, he locked me in the basement. She choked on her words, and I gently squeezed her hand. "At first, he threatened to throw me into the incinerator. But instead, he put me in the basement." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. "Why would he do such a thing?" I asked. Sarah let out a deep sigh. "Because I found out about his affair." He panicked. At that moment, a police officer entered the room. "Sarah, can we talk to you?" Sarah nodded, and I held her hand as I listened to her testimony. The details of Robert's affair, how Sarah had found evidence, and how Robert had threatened her and eventually locked her in the basement all came to light. When she finished speaking, the police officer said quietly, "Robert has already been arrested. We're still investigating the bones found in the incinerator." Sarah asked in a trembling voice, "Jimmy? Is Jimmy okay?" "Jimmy is fine," I reassured her. "I'm taking care of him now." Sarah closed her eyes in relief. "Thank you, Martha." As I left the hospital room that night, I renewed my determination. From now on, I would protect Sarah and Jimmy, and walk a new path in life with them. While Sarah was recovering in the hospital, I continued my efforts to uncover the truth. With each visit to her hospital room, Sarah gradually shared more about the terrifying events of those days. I found messages on Robert's phone from an unfamiliar woman, Sarah began in a shaky voice. At first, I wanted to believe it was nothing. But I nodded quietly at her words. So, you confronted Robert. Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Yes. But he flew into a rage. That was the beginning of it all. From Sarah's testimony, the existence of Robert's mistress came to light. Her name was Carol, a colleague from Robert's workplace. As the police investigation progressed, new facts emerged. Carol had also been reported missing a few weeks earlier. A missing person report was filed for Carol, the detective in charge informed me. The timing of her disappearance is close to when Sarah was confined. This information weighed even heavier on my heart. What had Robert done? And the bones found in the incinerator. I decided to gather information from the local community as well. I visited the town library and the cafe Sarah frequented, talking to people. Mary, the librarian, had some interesting information. Just before Sarah disappeared, I saw her having a heated argument with a woman named Carol, Mary said. They were both upset, and I remember Carol shouting, "Stay away from him." Jennifer, a waitress at the cafe, also provided crucial testimony. That day, I saw Robert with Carol. They seemed very intimate. As I gathered this information, the outline of the incident gradually became clearer in my mind. However, big questions remained. Where was Carol? And did Robert really? Every night, I compiled this information in my notebook, forming as many hypotheses as possible. As sleepless nights continued, I vowed not to give up until I reached the truth. For Jimmy's sake, for Sarah's sake, and for our entire family, I had to uncover the truth. That thought kept me going. The truth came to light just before Robert's trial was set to begin. After consulting with his lawyer, Robert decided to confess to all his crimes. I listened to Robert's confession at the police station. His face was haggard, and the light had gone from his eyes. "Mom, I'll tell you everything," Robert said in a thin voice. Robert and Carol's relationship had begun about a year ago. It started with casual conversations and eventually deepened into a serious affair. Things with Sarah had cooled off. Carol understood me, Robert explained. But it was a mistake. The situation took a drastic turn the night Sarah discovered the affair. Sarah confronted Robert and demanded a separation. Panicking, Robert threatened Sarah and locked her in the basement. I wanted time. Time to think, Robert continued in a trembling voice. But the most shocking truth was yet to come. Robert began to speak painfully about Carol's disappearance. That night, Carol came to the house. She said she wanted to talk about Sarah. Robert's eyes filled with tears. But we argued. Robert and Carol's argument escalated, and he accidentally pushed her down the stairs. Carol, she stopped moving. I got scared. Robert covered his face with his hands. In a panic, Robert tried to dispose of Carol's body in the incinerator. And in the process, Jimmy witnessed it. When Jimmy saw me, I didn't know what to do anymore. As I listened to Robert's confession, I was at a loss for words. The terrible crime my son had committed, and how he had imprisoned Sarah and destroyed our family to hide that crime. I threatened Sarah to hide everything, Robert said finally. But I'm not running away anymore. I'll take responsibility for everything. After finishing his confession, Robert hung his head low. I looked at him with mixed emotions. As anger, sadness, and love for my son intermingled, I thought about the long road ahead. A few days after Robert's confession, he was formally arrested and sent to court. I watched from in front of the police station as Robert, now in handcuffs, got into the police vehicle. His back was hunched, and there was no trace left of my once proud son. "Mom, I'm sorry," he said, turning back before getting into the car. Those words tore my heart to pieces. Sarah was discharged from the hospital and came to recuperate at our house. Her eyes held deep sadness, but also a glimmer of new determination. "Martha, I'm so grateful you're here," Sarah said, holding my hand. "I don't know what to do from here." "We'll get through this together," I replied. "For Jimmy's sake too." Jimmy didn't fully understand what had happened, but he was keenly aware of the change in the family atmosphere. He became more clingy than before, especially afraid to sleep alone at night. "Grandma, is Daddy never coming back?" Jimmy asked one night. "Jimmy, Daddy is going to be away for a while," I answered gently. "But we're here. Mommy, Grandma, we're right here with you, okay?" As the days passed, we slowly began to look forward. Sarah started receiving psychological counseling, and Jimmy began attending a new daycare. While supporting them, I also faced my own emotional wounds. One evening, as the three of us sat in the garden, Jimmy suddenly burst out laughing. It felt like the most beautiful music I'd heard in this house in a long time. Sarah and I looked at each other and smiled softly. In that moment, I was certain we would overcome this ordeal and walk together as a new family. "Well, shall we prepare dinner?" I stood up. "I'll help," Sarah followed. Jimmy jumped up happily, shouting, "I'll help too. This is where our new life begins."